Hello, welcome, and thanks to Daniel Lazare for joining me today for discussion. Daniel, welcome.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Daniel Lazare is a U.S. constitutional historian and a seasoned political commentator. So, Dan, we're going to avail of your tremendous insights today, hopefully. The subject, Dan, is the continuing and seems to be increasing protests across the United States in university and college campuses against the violence in Gaza. Um, Hundreds, thousands of students have been arrested. The protests seem to be, at least from this side of the Atlantic, seem to be gathering even more momentum as the horror in Gaza uh, compounds and increases. My question to you, Dan, is it in this presidential year with Biden up for election versus Donald Trump, do you see these protests and the whole violence in Gaza costing the Democrat Party, Biden, the incumbent President Biden, will this cost him the White House?
I think it'll hurt Biden. It's hard to say what the total effect will be, but it definitely will be negative. It definitely will harm his prospects for reelection. The obvious parallels with 1968. In 1968, the Democratic Party had their national convention in Chicago in August in order to nominate Hubert Humphrey against Richard Nixon, the Republican candidate. And viewers may remember that there were outside the convention in Chicago exploded in riots as thousands of anti-Vietnam protesters descended upon the city. They were met with an absolutely brutal reaction from the Chicago police. There was extensive fighting. It caused an uproar inside the convention. In a famous moment, a senator named Abraham Ribicoff said, denounced quote Gestapo tactics on the streets of Chicago, bringing a profane response from the mayor of the city, Mayor Daley, who screamed at him obscenities. We have no idea because the microphones were not on, but they clearly seem to be obscenities. But the point is that incident, that hugely disruptive incident, certainly helped Hubert Humphrey and paved the way for Nixon's election the following November, 3 months later. So I think that the effect could very well be the same.
Daniel, if I might just go back on that whole episode, and I think you're right, there's really strong echoes of 1968 and how the Democrat Party, which was incumbent in the White House at the time, we had Johnson as the president, although he wasn't standing again in 1968. But his would-be successor, Hubert Humphrey, who you mentioned, wasn't he really, he lost a lot of the Democratic potential vote over the Vietnam War. I mean, a lot of the youth, well, not just the youth, but a lot of the American people were rightly disgusted and outraged by the Vietnam War, and that turned them against the Democrat Party. The voters that would have maybe voted for Hubert Humphrey, they just abstained from voting for him, and then that lost his election.
Yes, it's exactly what happened. I mean, that wasn't the only factor, obviously, but it's a very important factor. It was demoralizing for the Democrats. I mean, essentially, you had two candidates, both of whom were committed to waging that war. So, I mean, it was for the anti-war movement. It was proof that the entire Washington establishment, that the two-party dictatorship that exists in Washington, was completely unanimous in backing that war, and so therefore it led to a further radicalization in the streets. So the fighting in Chicago was just the first stage of a growing radicalization, which would continue building for at least the next 2 years.
Yeah.
And it's worth pointing out that a few months earlier, students at Columbia University
Mm.
had occupied the university in protest of the war, and occupied an important campus building called Hamilton Hall, the same building that protesters now have occupied. I mean,
Yeah.
whether they were aware of the historical parallel, it's really sort of interesting how almost a kind of historical instinct leads them to exactly the same spot to repeat exactly the same
Mm.
incident that occurred more than 60 years ago.
Mm. I think, Daniel, a lot of observers around the world, including myself, would be very much impressed and would commend the US students, the university students, for taking a stand here, because up to now, after 7 months of absolute horrific violence by the Israeli regime against the Palestinian people, enabled totally by Washington's military support, it's just shocking. I think it's very shocking and disturbing for people around the world that nothing is happening in terms of restraining this Israeli regime. And the students across the United States taking this stand of protest against what they would call as a genocide, and people would agree with them on that. It's very well, you know, encouraging and very noble of them to take this stand. I mean, I think people are very much in admiration about their very strong stand for international law and human rights, with the result that the political establishment in the US seems to be very isolated, very exposed for what they're standing up for, which is more violence in Gaza.
Well, there's no doubt the U.S. is in the middle of a growing political crisis at all levels. I think the U.S. is the most unstable country in the OECD, with the possible exception of Turkey.
Mm.
And this is really remarkable. We just sort of ponder this for a second. This is the global hegemon. It's deeply unstable. Its politics are in crisis. So the situation, in a way, is without equal since 1789.
Mm.
The political system is hanging by a balance. We have a right-wing authoritarian who was at the point of taking power. Uh, uh, Congress has been in gridlock for 30 years. We have a far right-wing Supreme Court. We have an economy that's in deep trouble. So the U.S., as I said, is in crisis,
Mm.
and this specific aspect is due to U.S. Middle East policy,
Mm.
which has essentially, been a top imperial concern since 1980. I mean, control of the Persian Gulf and its vast energy resources has been an absolute top priority. And that has driven the US into an ever closer alliance with Israel, the preeminent military power in the region, and has led the US to countenance whatever Israel does.
Mm.
So this is a state that prior to October 7th was staging pogroms of the kind we haven't seen since turn of the century Tsarist Russia, when they were turned against the Jews.
Mm.
Now the Zionists were turning them against the Palestinians.
Mm.
But the US was backing them at every step of the way. And not only that, the so-called Abraham Accords, the Saudi Israeli alliance the US is trying to cobble together, the whole purpose of that alliance was essentially to bury the Palestinian issue for good, so that Israel would have a free hand for as long as anyone could foresee to carry out its ethnic cleansing policies.
Mm.
Um, Now, that exploded on October 7th. I am in no way whatsoever approving of what Hamas did on October 7th. In fact, I think what Hamas did on October 7th was utterly disastrous, first and foremost for the Palestinian people themselves. But nonetheless, it certainly blew this phony peace out of the water. and U.S. foreign policy has been in crisis, and now that crisis is roiling the waters back home, as these demonstrations show.
Right. Dan, just go back to 1968, and I'm just going to kind of recap on that parallel. So the Democrats lost the incumbent Democrat lost it in 1968 because of the war in Vietnam, which many people would class as a genocidal war against Vietnam. And here we have in 2024 the Democrat incumbent Joe Biden could lose the White House because of this genocide in Gaza, which he's associated with. I mean, he's accused of being complicit in. So, I mean, it's really if the Democrats lose this election in November, I mean, it's really all on their own head, isn't it? I think. Would you agree that they have kind of undermined their credibility or their any respect among the young voters?
Oh yes, yeah, that's absolutely correct. But the Democrats have no choice. I mean, this imperial policy of prioritizing control of the Persian Gulf. I mean, this is a completely bipartisan policy. I mean, the starting date was late January 1980, when, in response to the Soviet incursion to Afghanistan, only a few weeks earlier, President Jimmy Carter, announced what's called the Carter Doctrine. It was written by Zbigniew Brzezinski, his national security advisor. And that doctrine said that henceforth control of the Persian Gulf and its energy resources would be an American priority, and America would essentially make sure that control remained in its hands, and that no one else would have any degree of control. So that led to what? 4 major wars in the region. It led to 2 generations of bloodshed and destruction. But the U.S. is completely locked into this policy. This policy is inescapable as far as a U.S. foreign policy is concerned.
Yeah. Well, just to put it to take that point on, Daniel, further. So this whole crisis in the Middle East, in Gaza, would you say it's exposing the uniparty, the uniformity between the two parties, both the Democrat and the Republican Party, both stand for imperialistic war, and in some ways a positive way to kind of a positive look on this situation is it's a realization, an opportunity for people in the US, the young voters especially, to realize that it's really a monopoly power situation, a uniparty or a war party, one party, whether they're Democrat or Republican. Is this a potentially historic wake-up call? You mentioned 1968 was a wake-up call. Again, is this like another wake-up call, but perhaps on a bigger scale?
Yes, it is a wake-up call. Bigger scale, I don't know, because that was big back in 68 to 70, but this is going to be very big as well. I mean, as I said, U.S. foreign policy, the entire thrust of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East is now hanging in the balance. And you're absolutely right. This is a uniparty. There is complete agreement across the board on these policies. That the House of Representatives, the lower house, just voted 4-1, I believe, to adopt the IHRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition of anti-Semitism, which essentially says that criticism of Israel as a racist state is anti-Semitic. So what that does, if that is approved by the Senate and adopted and signed by Biden, and there will be great political pressure on him to do that, what that means is that anti-Zionism is being outlawed in the US. And when I mean anti-Zionism, I mean any attempt to politically or ideologically analyze what Zionism is about, and how Zionism really is a kind of inverted anti-Semitism, where the hatred that was directed against Jews is now redirected against Palestinians.
Mm-hmm.
Any attempt to come to grips with that ideology is going to be illegal,
Mm-hmm.
meaning that if you're a university professor who touches on this subject, you can get fired.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a university administrator
Mm-hmm.
who allows a professor to hold forth on this topic, you can have your funds yanked.
Yeah.
Uh, this is very, very serious. So essentially, this entire foreign policy is throwing the U.S. into crisis and causing this growing
Mm-hmm.
domestic upheaval.
Yeah. Yeah, indeed. And it's kind of like it seems to be kind of like crystallizing a kind of a very sinister power structure in the United States. I mean, you're talking about, Daniel, the criminalization of peaceful protest or just, First Amendment rights of free speech. This is quite a shocking, attack on democratic rights. And may I kind of put it out there that we're seeing the emergence of a fascistic kind of state where the power structure is completely intolerant, hostile to free speech and peaceful protest against a genocide. They're cracking down on peaceful protest against a genocide that the US is supporting. And Trump and the so-called opposition, they want an even fiercer crackdown on the protests. From what I can tell from media reports, they're calling for an even more draconian police crackdown. So, what does that say about the state of power, the nature of power in the United States?
It suggests that authoritarianism is not due solely to one man. I mean, if you listen to the Democrats, it's all the fault of this guy, with the big orange bouffant hairdo.
Hmm.
But it's clearly not. Clearly, Trump is a product of increasingly authoritarian tendencies in U.S. politics, and this episode is bringing those to the fore. I mean, it's amazing how the House, with little debate and quite overwhelmingly, moves to shut down an entire movement, shut down an entire line of analysis, to regiment free, speech and thinking, with little debate. It just moves by rote. So this
Mm.
is how authoritarian states react, and this movement is growing, and it's
Yes.
growing under Biden. I mean, Biden attacked the protests as anti-Semitic and therefore
Yeah.
illegitimate.
Yes.
And I must say, there have been, by the way, I was up at Columbia this morning. The campus is now sealed tight. I couldn't get in. But the the whole point is that they are determined to completely squelch all dissent from this major aspect
Yeah.
of U.S. foreign policy. These protests are striking at imperial policy in a way unequaled since 68 to 70, when the
Mm.
entire U.S. anti-communist war effort was coming under attack. In this case, the entire U.S. effort to control the Middle East is now coming under attack in a very direct way, and the ruling class is moving to crush it.
Mm. Yeah, I've noticed, Daniel, in the reporting, the media refer to these protests at the universities and the campuses as pro-Palestinian protests, and also that canard about them being, anti-Semitic and trying to smear the protests. And by referring to them as pro-Palestinian, it's kind of like getting away from distracting from, which is, I think, the central issue, which is anti-genocide. They're protesting against US foreign policy, which is genociding, 34,000 Palestinians and counting. So, it's the media is trying to either smear it as being the protest being anti-Semitic, or it's pro-Palestine, and Trump would say pro-Hamas and things like that. So it's trying to criminalize and smear what are genuine and admirable protests against U.S. imperial foreign policy.
Well, I've actually used the phrase pro-Palestine myself. But I agree. The anti-Semitic smear is very important. That aspect is very important. And I think that there has been little or nothing in terms of anti-Semitism, emanating out of any of these protests.
Yeah.
I mean, at Columbia, not this weekend, but the weekend before, there were a couple of ugly incidents by certain individuals chanting, anti-Semitic, pro-violence statements, but they clearly were from outside the movement. They were quickly and immediately repudiated by the great majority, the bulk of the protests themselves. So these people have worked very hard at keeping these things on target, on point, screening out anything along the lines of anti-Semitism. And I think that no reasonable person, strolling through these encampments, would find anything that is racially, religiously, or ethnically threatening about them.
Well,
any reasonable person.
Just to add to Daniel, to make your point, to add to your point, I mean, many of the protesters are Jewish,
Yes.
of Jewish faith, and many of the protesters who've been arrested are Jewish students who are condemning the genocide of this Zionist regime. So there is no contradiction, for many Jewish people of genuine morals and convictions, that they are protesting against the Zionist regime. But the media certainly, or certain politicians like in the Republican Party, certainly have been trying to smear and Biden too, of course, as the protest being anti-Semitic. And you had Netanyahu reportedly complaining to the White House to crack down more on the protests because they're anti-Semitic. Here you've got a potentially wanted war criminal laying down to the United States how it should police its citizens. It's quite bizarre, really.
Yeah, well, what we're seeing here is, to a certain extent, a war among the Jews. You have one portion of the international Jewish community, which has embraced the racially exclusivist policies of Zionism, and another part of the community, especially in the diaspora, which recognizes that the survival and good health of the Jewish community is predicated upon a regime of based on equality, racial equality, anti-discrimination, etc. I mean, the great majority of American Jews feel this in their bones. They know that if racial discrimination is legalized, if it's permitted in any way, they will get it in the neck next. That will make them vulnerable. So therefore, they are strongly committed to a policy of anti-racism, anti-discrimination, which puts them at odds with the increasingly racist state in Israel.
And let's not forget, Daniel, one of the most famous international figures, of Jewish heritage, Albert Einstein, was vehemently against the formation of Israel in 1948. He wrote letters to the New York Times and other for condemning this violation of the indigenous rights of Palestine, that area. in this contrived setup of a Zionist regime. So, you know, if, just to highlight your point that you know, there is not a conflict, you know, between Jewish people and the Israeli state. Not necessarily a conflict. It's not the to be against Zionism is not to be anti-Semitic or, you know, racist towards Jewish people. Daniel, can I just ask you on a wider um, sort of a wider scope here? Would these protests, we've talked about, you put it very well, how the protests are revealing to a lot of the youth in the United States, but not just the youth. I mean, all age groups, but primarily it was the younger voters. It's highlighting or revealing the monopoly between the two parties, that there is no such thing as a choice, democratic choice in the United States. There hasn't been for decades. And do you think, Daniel, that these protests are a kind of a catalyst to a much wider radicalization among the American youth and the American people in general towards seeing American power as being based on violence, imperialistic criminality, and that there needs to be a whole new politics in the United States? I mean, a new party, other forms of representation that actually represent people's interests, workers' interests, youth, students' interests. Do you think this could be a, how would you say, a catalyst towards a wider, more progressive radicalization in American politics?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that, as I said before, I think American politics are in crisis. I think America is the most unstable country in the OECD, the club of advanced capitalist nations, and I think that not since 1789 has instability and hegemony coincided in such an explosive manner. I mean, America is the global hegemon, and it's also in deep crisis. And so this means that crisis applies not only to America, it's a crisis which involves the world. And I don't want to be, I don't want to come across as some kind of American narcissist who believes that we are the world, everything, America, America is the only country that counts. But it is the global hegemon, and therefore, if it's in crisis, then the entire U.S. imperial system is in crisis.
Daniel, and what was the difference with 1968 then? Was the US not the elite hegemon then? It had the crisis of the Vietnam War, the dissent among the population. What's kind of slightly different about this year, this time in history, 2024?
That's an excellent question. The big difference between 2024 and 1968 is you had a huge socialist camp. You had the USSR, you had the PRC, the People's Republic of China. You had a revolution in Vietnam that was very powerful. You had labor unrest in Europe and throughout the third world. The U.S. was fighting for its life. It was on the ropes, and it was struggling to hold on in Vietnam in order to maintain its grip on global politics, which at the time seemed far more tenuous than it does now. Now, it's 2024, the collapse of the Soviet bloc is 33 to 35 years in the past. The U.S. is the closest thing to a unipower that we have seen in modern history. Its power seems to be complete, overarching, totalitarian, really. But yet that power is an extreme crisis.
So you would say, Daniel, sorry to cut in on you, Daniel, I'm just mindful of the time ticking away.
Sure.
But you would say, in other words, that the US is more vulnerable now as opposed
It's
to,
simultaneously more powerful and more vulnerable. That is the great contradiction. I
yeah.
mean, it's the unipower. Its reach is nothing short of global. Yet
Mm,
at the same time, it is in deep crisis.
yeah.
So the global system is more unified and more crisis ridden than even it was in the late 60s.
Right. Okay, Daniel. And I think it's remarkable too. It's significant too, Daniel, that the young people, the young demographic in the United States, they're also very critical of capitalism, in a way that hasn't been seen for a long time. Um, Several polls indicate that the youth in the States, in the United States, are very critical and very aware of the unsustainability of the capitalist system. Uh, when this is kind of like compounded with fierce criticism of the imperialistic foreign policy, I'm just wondering, is that kind of consciousness, awareness of the failure of capitalism, the failure of imperialism, especially as seen with Gaza right now, if there ever was a need for a clearer demonstration on the absolute criminality of imperialism, it's seen in Gaza. Now, when you combine that with the youth's awareness of the failures of capitalism, we could have a potentially radical moment.
Yes, I totally agree. The critique is much more thoroughgoing now than it was in the late 60s.
Yeah.
And yes, it's 15 years or 16 years since the great financial meltdown. The international economy has been deeply sick ever since. Economic polarization is growing by leaps and bounds to unbelievable ways. Wages are stagnant. Social distress is growing throughout the U.S. And homelessness, housing inflation is a hugely important factor. Millions of families are just one step away from being thrown out into the streets. And then there's war, and then there is global warming, which is
Mm.
accelerating and which clearly none of the capitalist powers, the US first and foremost, not only do they have no idea of what to do, they have no intention of
Mm.
doing anything serious in order to to combat this growing catastrophe. So
And
yeah,
and
so
and
people are aware of something really big, a
mm,
big crisis that is shaping up.
and also, Daniel, I'll just emphasize as well that the ugly face of state power, the like fascist control of the power, the use of the police to crush any protest. We see it in Germany, France, all across Europe, and in the United States with the student protests. So, yes, I think I'm glad to hear you saying that, Daniel, because it's sort of corroborated my gut feelings that we are at quite a cusp of a very important historic moment of change for the good, despite the horrors that are extant right now. But there is a potential for something very progressive to emerge here.
Yeah, it's a fraught moment. There are dangers and opportunities, but it's certainly the world is really on a knife edge at this point,
Yeah.
and I think it's really a critical moment.
Uh, Daniel Lazare, thank you so much for your company and your insights, your great knowledge on the US Constitution, the history of US politics. Thank you very much, Daniel.
Thank you, Finian. It was a pleasure.
True, Daniel.
Bye bye.
Bye bye. Oh, I'll have to put the glasses on.
Oh,
Thanks,
okay.
Daniel.
That's my pleasure. It was great. That was really great. How are you doing?
Oh, good, Daniel. I'm just going to